All right, Big Man, today is Thursday. It's April 20th. Welcome to the Dog Walk presented by Barstool Sports. I'm joined on Zoom by Jeff Nadu. We're going to do some little mob act. It's feel like you're a monthly guest now, Jeff. You come on like once a month. You come in, you do your mob stuff or just crime activity in general. We did the Mexico thing last time about the cosmetic surgeries and whatnot. So it's good to have you in, giving us updates, talking about crazy stories because everyone likes a little nefarious activity talk, right? So welcome back,
Mob
Jeff.
stuff is always popping.
Yeah, it is, dude. It is. It's like,
I appreciate you having me as always. I always enjoy doing a dog walk. We've done a couple good ones. We did the federal prison one. We've
yep,
done the Mexico one. We John Gotti,
yep.
and we got some more wild stuff today.
Yeah, for sure. So we were actually going to get into a different story, and we pulled like a last minute audible here that we're going to go to one of the crazier stories that got coverage at the beginning, I felt, but the aftermath, which is even crazier, did not get the coverage it deserved, in my opinion. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is the world turns in the mob, right? There's a lot of compelling storylines, right, from the 100-year history that the mob's been around in New York or Chicago or wherever. But yeah, I mean, this story, I think it didn't get I think when it first happened, it, as you said, got a lot of pub, but no one really followed up on it. And it kind of happened. And I think people kind of forgot about the mob in 2019 and recently, but this story is wild and it's super compelling. And I think the guy that ended up doing what he did, it was a, crazy kind of ending, if you will.
Yeah, no, for sure. So we could get into it. When was this, Jeff? Like 2019?
Yeah, so this happened in March of 2019. And I remember the day this happened because this was, I think, the first day of March Madness in 2019. It was a Thursday, I believe. So let me kind of set the stage. So the five families in New York City are still around. All of them are still active. They're not as powerful as they once were. They're definitely neutered, if you will. It's very hard for them to do anything because the federal government is largely involved with, and they've hurt the mob a lot over the years, bringing them down with RICO and things like that. But I would say the two strongest families today and in 2019 were the Gambino and Genovese crime families. The Gambinos in the late 2010s, once the Gotti regime ended, the son, the father, and the uncle, once they were out of the way, certain Sicilian gangsters came in and really took the family to another level. Guys like Frank Cali, the guy that was killed, people like him were very integral in taking the family to a lot more legit businesses. A lot of money was coming in. And they were a really strong family. They had a lot of strong people in it. And this guy, Frank Cali, at the time, was essentially the leader of the Gambino crime family. He was a very powerful guy. He married a woman that was tied to a very powerful family in Sicily. This guy had come up under very powerful people. Frank Cali was one of the strongest, most influential gangsters in New York City. And in March of 2019, he's at his house, just like any normal person is. It's 7, 8 o'clock at night, to which his car, he has a Cadillac Escalade out front. He lives in this really ritzy area in Staten Island, Tote Hill. It's the same place that Paul Castellano lived. He's sitting there and he gets a knock on his door. And this kid, this 20-something kid is at the door. And he says, hey, I just hit your truck. So weirdly enough, Callie walks out. He doesn't think anything of it, walks out and doesn't walk back in. And this story took on a bunch of different angles, Eddie, because a lot of people, I think when this first happened, a lot of people wondered, is this a mob related thing? Are these families warring again? Even the mayor at the time mentioned, is this a war developing? And people really wondered, but we would find out that had a lot of tentacles all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, it was anything but that. But at the time, I remember it happening. That's why I said the beginning part of it got a ton of publicity because it's like, oh my God, it's March of 2019. A lot of people think that these factions, these families are long gone, and we have someone getting a hit on them. I believe it was in broad daylight too, right?
Yeah, it was just, so Callie walks out and he starts kind of assessing the damage to his truck. And this kid, Anthony Camello was his name. He was this kind of unemployed character from Staten Island, kind of a rich kid, if you will. His family had businesses, and he, you know, and I'll get to kind of why he did this, but he claims that during this little argument, Cali reaches for a gun. He then reaches out and shoots Cali multiple times and kills him in the street. He then flees and goes on the run, and they catch him, I think, the next day in New Jersey at some vacation home his parents had. But once we find this out, this goes crazy because this is a huge story. This isn't some associate to the mafia. This is essentially the boss of the Gambino crime family, a very powerful guy. So I think the media always runs with mob stories, right? Anytime they include the mafia in a headline, it's always going to do numbers. And as you said, the radio and the TV, and they picked it up as it was a war. But we would find out that Camelo was this QAnon supporter, essentially. He was a guy who believed Frank Cali was part of the deep state and that he afforded protection from Donald Trump, and that Cali was part of a group and a triumvirate that was attempting to take Donald Trump down. And we would find that like months before, Camelo was going into New York City and attempting to like arrest politicians, citizens arrest, because he didn't believe they were doing correct things. They were part of this, I guess this cabal of like people that he doesn't agree with. And if you know anything about QAnon, that's kind of what they believe. They believe that there's this cabal of people that are part of the deep state that are trying to take over and remove Donald Trump.
Which is
it's just kind of a wild group.
Dude, I mean, it's a super wild group for sure. And that's why it's crazy. People are like, oh my God, like we're back at Sparks. We have an old school mob hit in our hand. We got Gotti doing like Gotti-esque shit. And so that's what people thought. And then, like you said, lo and behold, it's just some QAnon nut job who.
Yeah, real quick. And what's crazy is like we started hearing, like I remember hearing in some of the circles that I get information from, like I think the Daily News at one point said that was this John Gotti's older brother, Gene, who had just gotten out of prison. He's like in his 80s. And it was like really irresponsible reporting, but it was like, we include the name Gotti in the headlines, so we're going to put it out. But it was super bad reporting. Like it was just, we're going to try to push stuff out and see whatever strikes. And then the media looked stupid because it turned out that they didn't wait for the details. And it was just some lunatic. And in his interrogation, like he would ultimately say all sorts of stuff because it would eventually go that it wasn't the mob. It was some kid that Cali told him that he couldn't date Cali's niece. Like this kid supposedly wanted to date a family member of Frank Cali, and Cali said no. We would find out though that that wasn't true at all, and that this Camelo kid claimed that he didn't know where that came from, and that he started telling like the police that he had AIDS and that he wasn't dating anybody at the time, and that he was just worried that Cali was this deep state agent. He just started going off on all sorts of tangents. He went into court with like stuff written all over his hand, MAGA and Q and all this stuff, and just a total lunatic.
Yeah, and that's that. You say that too, and it goes from reporting of that. Yeah, this is a mafia thing. Someone from another family took him down. Then it's a family thing. Someone's trying to date his daughter. It's crazy how wild. And for the record, Frank Cali was 53, like not an old guy at all. And
No.
like he was. What was his role exactly, Jeff, at the time?
Yeah, so Cali was a guy that took, as I said, in the mid 2000s, he takes the Gambinos, and several other people take the Gambinos from kind of a ship that's uncontrolled to a ship that gets into calmer waters and starts to make money again, right? He was, again, part of the Sicilian faction. The Gambinos have always had people from Sicily that have come over and taken some control in the family. Like I said, after the Gotti regime. And families do this. They have people that come over from Sicily, and they're warranted as very high-ranking people. But Frank Cali was connected. In fact, in a wiretap, at one point, someone from Sicily says to someone from Sicily, they're on a phone call, he says, Frank Cali's everything for us over there. He's our guy. he supplants everything. He makes decisions. And he had kind of risen to the top of the Gambino crime family. It was essentially the acting boss. These families today, Eddie, don't make it clear who the boss is. Back in the day, we knew John Gotti was the boss. Today, the families are a little bit more cognizant. They want to make it kind of unclear who the boss is. But a lot of people had the belief that Frank Cali may have not been categorized as boss, but was making the real decisions behind the scenes at this time. There was kind of like a triumvirate. He was towards the top of the family. And Frank Cali was a rich man. He had a lot of legitimate businesses, import-export businesses. He had a fruit company. He was a wholesaler. He did a lot of really lucrative businesses. And this wasn't some mob associate on the street that was, taking bets or something. This was a high-ranking guy with ties to Sicily. And a lot of people worried for this Camello, and they still worry for him today that, someone's going to take retribution at some point, because I think as neutered as the mob is, there are still people that are powerful left in these families. And Frank Cali was definitely one of them for sure.
You know what's crazy, Jeff, is a few things that I want to get into, but it's kind of just, the whole thing just shows not the fragility of life, but you know what it reminds me of? And I know you're a big fan. You're a big Wire fan, and I hate to compare, art to real life, but it's kind of how people were upset when Omar, how he went. But I think that's just showing that no matter who you are, like,
you can get got.
Yeah, like, doesn't matter by who.
I think the thought is, though, like, in this case, I remember when this happened, I remember someone saying to me, imagine Carlo Gambino in the 70s just walking out of his house as some random kid knocks on the door. And like back in the day, it seemed like Frank Cali let his guard down here to me, but I think he didn't think anything of it. But
why would you have any reason to think anything of it?
Exactly. And that's the thing. Like, this is why, like, I think, and this goes into a whole nother conversation about making sure you're aware of your surroundings and what goes on. Some knock at the door, you think it's nothing, and it could be some lunatic. So I think you have to be very cognizant. But yeah, I don't think Frank thought anybody would hit him. I think he felt like he had that kind of reputation, and who would go into Toad Hill, one of the ritziest areas in New York, and then that area, and knock on his door and then shoot him on the street. But you're right. I mean, you, as they say, live by the sword, die by the sword. But I think the thought of Frank Cali would have been he either would have went to prison, which he did at one point. He's been in prison, but the thought was he'd either go to prison or, the feds would be after him forever, and he would have to battle that. But nobody thought this would happen. Now, Camello was, I think, also in another conversation. You kind of have to get into mental health, right? Because this goes back to that same question. Yeah. This is obviously a very kind of dangerous character to be on the street. I mean, he obviously had some real odd fantasies. He had some odd beliefs, and he believed he was some sort of, protected individual by the president, like the president knew him or something.
Yeah, I mean, he was disturbed. Like, there's really no other way to put it, right?
Yeah, it's but I think, Eddie, it also kind of, and I don't mean to belittle Frank Cali. From what I know about Frank Cali, he's, he was one of the only, I think, true mafioso left that definitely had power. But I think this also shadows what the mob is today. The mob is a fractured group of people who, I keep going back to the word neutered, but that's what they are. They are clipped. There's not much they can do anymore. The power that they once had, like I said, this wouldn't happen under a Carlo Gambino, even John Gotti. I mean, John Gotti wouldn't walk out like something like this. They had power back then. They had the ability where they could, they were feared, right? And you didn't want to go and mess with them. They had the ability to get rid of you at any time, right? Like, I look at what I do, Eddie, like talking about the mob. I couldn't do what I do in the 70s or 80s.
No.
It just wouldn't happen.
No.
Today, it's different. The mob is not a group that has the ability to scare people. They're very fractured on what they can do to people. They don't go kill people. There's an edict in the five families. They don't kill people anymore. Nobody's scared of them. And that's, I think, the problem you have here. And that's an overarching problem the mob has in general. They have two problems. They are not feared, and the federal government has a hard on for them and has always had a hard on for them. So I think that's kind of where we are, and that's why something like this can happen.
Now, I wanna get into that because I want to challenge you on that. You don't think there's any opportunity that some complete lunatic like this guy would have killed some of those guys back in the day? I mean, look at, what's Hinkley, the guy who shot Reagan. The guys like that existed back then. Now, is it because you think they were so feared that they would never go down that path? But I don't think those people live like they have anything to lose.
But put it like this, Eddie. I think let's say the 80s, for instance, and this actually happened. John Gotti in the 80s, when he took over in 85, in 1986, he was in Queens at his social club, Burger and Hunt and Fish Club, and he was walking out, and him and his crew heard what he thought were gunshots coming at him. He thought someone was trying to shoot at him. They chased the individual down and tortured him and killed him. That's what they did. So that moves through the neighborhood, and people know who these people are. They don't fuck with them. It doesn't happen. There's very rare. This wouldn't happen back in the day. The fear was there where you weren't just going to go knock on the door of something. Now, this guy, could he have done this and was some lunatic and maybe could have did this? Yeah, but I don't think he would have lived. Frank Cali would have had people around him at all times. I just think Frank Cali let his guard down. It's that simple. I think he believed that no one was crazy. But then again, in this day and age, I think everybody's a lot crazier. I don't know if anyone would be ballsy enough to do this back in the 70s or 80s. But I think, again, it goes back to the adage of what the mob is today. Most people, like, for instance, most people like you believe that the mob is dead. You talk about the mob, it's like, wait, they're still around? Like, I thought they were gone in the late 80s, early 90s. They're still around, but they're just not feared anymore.
Yeah,
you don't
it's
hear
different. And I knew they were around to some aspect. I just didn't know what it was like now. But
to answer your original question, if somebody tried to do this, they would make an example out of them, like Gotti did. Gotti was called that day, and they said, "We got him here. What do you want us to do?" He said, "Kill him." There was no question. And we would find out years later that the guy that supposedly shot at John Gotti, many people believe it was a truck backing up that they mistaked for gunshots, and the guy that they killed was just some innocent guy.
Really?
So, it was. And again, that leads back to fear. Like, when you have the ability to take care of people, people don't mess with you. Nowadays, nobody fears the mob. Back then, people feared the mob because the mob could get you anytime, anywhere.
Yeah.
If you did something stupid, they were going to get you.
Mm-hmm.
They can't do that now. It's a lot different. The mob hasn't killed. No mobster has killed another mobster for a very long time. The only mobsters that have been killed by other people. Like this situation. We were going to talk about another situation in a McDonald's parking lot in the Bronx, is in the news recently. That was an associate of the mafia, very rich guy in the Bronx, had a lot of mob backing. He was killed. It turned out it was his son, who was not connected to the mob, that wanted his inheritance. So he hired blood street gang members to kill him.
No shit.
All the mob murders we hear are not mobsters shooting other mobsters. It's these crazy individuals or some, other group that's hired. Mob doesn't kill mob anymore.
It makes me wonder too, Jeff, how when this initially did happen, the other families and all five, they all must have been like, "What the fuck is going on?" They probably had the worst assumptions of anybody. Of course, obviously, the media was trying to sensationalize stuff and trying to get headlines. But even themselves, until they really saw like the dust clear, it was going to be like that Bugs Bunny meme. It's time to go back to the old me. There might have been some feuds,
Well, and I think that's, if you look at the other five families for the most part, you look at the Genovese, the Lucchese family. I mean, they're very much underground. I mean, you have people that lead that family that there are maybe 3 or 4 pictures of on the internet. They're very quiet. They don't make waves. They're smart. They stay out of the line of fire and they don't bring attention to themselves. And I think, when this happened, people kind of said, "Whoa, Frank." I mean, like I keep going back to, this was not some, just street corner guy. This was a powerful guy who had a little power left. He was a broker in the family. He knew a lot of people. If there was anyone that I think would have been off limits, it would have been him. But then we find out that that's not exactly what happened. So I think the guard was up, where now these people are like, you know what, we got to be a little bit more careful with what we're doing. There are still things that go on with these families that are crazy. I did a blog a month ago or so about what's currently going on in the Bonanno crime family. The Bonanno crime family, you talk about a messy group, they're very messy. Some families are very messy, but most of them are behind the scenes and you just don't hear much from them. But, Anthony Comello would ultimately essentially plead insanity, and he's in a mental facility somewhere. And look, the federal government know and the state government know that if they put him in general population, he would have a problem. I do believe he would be killed, probably. I think if there's anyone that would be killed by the mob, they'd find a way to get to him. But the problem is, how do you do that, right? These guys are protected by the federal government. What are you going to do? So they're fractured. There's not much they can do.
And what was there anything specific besides get some Sicily people involved, the Genovese and the Gambino crime family? Why did they kind of rise to the top? Do you know?
Well, I mean, the Genovese family has always been the strongest of the five families. Anybody that knows the mob will tell you that. And that goes back to the original founder of what is now the Genovese family. The Genovese family used to be the Luciano crime family. Charlie Lucky Luciano created that. When he created the five families back in their early 30s, he was the patriarch of that family. They would then become the Genovese family in the 60s. But throughout their history, they have always had very shrewd decision makers at the top. So they created something called the front boss system. And I talked about this earlier. They would establish someone that the federal government believes is the boss, but in the background, the real boss is behind the shadows. No one really knows. And they've always been involved in unions, labor racketeering, money-making opportunities. You look at the skyline in New York, Trump Tower, Sloan Kettering, the Jacob Javits Center, any high-level project in the 80s that was being run was run by the Genovese family. Fat Tony Salerno, Vincent Giganti. Those people were the movers and shakers. The mob ran New York. And in the unions and labor racketeering, the Genovese crime family have always been very powerful. They control who gets jobs. They control everything. And they've always been what we would call the Ivy League of the mob. They're distinguished. They're smart. They're quiet. They don't make headlines. And the Gambino family, I think they're twofold powerful. I think during the Gambino Castellano era, they're very powerful. Once John Gotti took over, I think he hurt them. And then once his family was out of the way, I think they began to gain traction again. And I think a lot of it had to do with, as I said, the Sicilian faction of the family. These again, guys a lot like the Genovese, very quiet, don't make headlines, make money. That's what the mob should be. And that's what all these families have done. They go back into the shadows. And that's why the Genovese were able to do well for so long, because we didn't even know who the boss was. Mm-hmm. And that goes off into another show and their leadership.
Yeah, it's all very interesting, especially when you weave in crazy shit like this. So,
this is the mob, Eddie. This is the compelling nature of the mob. I mean, there are stories for days on this kind of stuff. Just crazy, wild things that have happened. That's why I always when I talk about the mob, like I think it, and that's why I started my show, because I think there's so many more compelling figures than John Gotti and Al Capone. I mean, there are so many interesting storylines throughout the 100-year history. But I'll say this as we end. I think you can tell the power of the mob. You know what we hear when we hear the mob today? You know what we think of? Sammy Gravano, YouTube. They're on YouTube.
Yeah.
The mafia is on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
That shows you the level of the mafia now, that people could, like, I had Frank Calabrese on. Your Chicago listeners will probably know who he is. Frank Calabrese cooperated against his own father, right? He has a YouTube channel. He runs tours in Chicago showing you where mobsters used to hang out. That shows you the level of where the mob is today. Yeah. Because in the 80s, Frank Calabrese ain't doing that. No. They just shut that down within 20 seconds, so it's that just kind of goes back to where it is. They've let their guard down. And yeah, I would highly recommend people look into this Comello story. It's pretty wild, and he'll have to look over his shoulder for the rest of his life.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. All right then, Jeff, thanks for doing this. Thanks for hopping on. It's always an interesting story whenever you hop on. So
yeah,
for everyone who's listening, go check out the sit down on YouTube, right?
Yeah, I did. I actually did this show in depth. I did a show about this whole situation. I talked about why the Gambino family didn't take revenge out, and I did a real deep dive into Frank Cali in his life, and I'll make sure I put that on my community page. People check that out. It's a pretty good story.
Perfect. So yeah, go check that out. Thanks again, Jeff. Thank you everybody for listening. Thank you for watching. That's it for today. We will see you all on Monday.